So I'd like to welcome our speakers this evening, Priya Gopal, Nassal Mia, and Kwame Anthony Appiah. The discussion will be very informal. There'll be lots of points where you can jump in with questions, and then we'll have some more time for questions. So the topic we are discussing this evening is the philosophy of race. Perhaps, Anthony, we can start with you. Perhaps you might tell us a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about race.
Well, we're talking about something that we made up. When I say we, it was made up in different ways in different places, different times. The sort of strong form of racial thinking that is present in the United Kingdom today has its own specific history. My own view is that it's very much connected with two things. First of all, the slave trade and the need to find rationalizations for the treatment of black people in the slave trade. And second, something completely different, which is the rise of a certain kind of biological thinking in the 19th century, which turned a category that was social and imaginatively perhaps natural into a supposedly scientific category in the 19th century. So what was the idea? Well, the idea was that you could divide the world into a small number of groups, and each group had some hereditary things about it that were handed on from parental members of the group to the descendant members of the group. And that those things, and I think this is a key part of what developed in the late 19th century in Britain and in the North Atlantic world more generally, that didn't just affect your skin and your hair and the shape of your nose and how big your lips were and whether your teeth were sharp or not, but it affected poetry and culture and philosophy and religion. That there was a deep, this was a deep thing. W.B. Du Bois said that it was physical for sure, but more deeply it was psychical and spiritual, and this is an African American speaking in the late 19th century. So I think that's sort of, now, we've inherited something slightly different from that. The biologists aren't on the side of this anymore, for one thing, but we still have, I think, we live with a legacy of that kind of thinking. And just to make one final point, things like this, descent-based characterizations of people, are not the unique prerogative of the North Atlantic. People do this all over the world, and so there's a family resemblance between the ways in which people think about race, what we call race now, in lots of places.
So how do we move from thinking, if you're saying that the history of this category is something we used to think about biologically, but that no longer holds. Is the category of race useful in other senses? Is it something that we've repurposed in fruitful ways?
I don't think I should be the only person, because that seems to be a question that we all can have views about.
Well, I mean, as Anthony suggests, it was seen as a biological category, but it's actually in most ways historical. And the fact that something is historical and not biological doesn't mean it's not real. It doesn't mean it doesn't have an operative force, whether we like it or not. And although a lot of people talk about being colorblind or not seeing race, the fact is that we all have some kind of racial identity within which we are seen and within which we work. So in a sense, it's not up to us, whether we accept race or not. Race takes us. So yes, I mean, repurposing is one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that thinking about race, about our own racializing and the way in which we racialize other people is very important to self-understanding, to thinking about how we became who we are and how we think about ourselves in relation to other people. That doesn't mean race is an essence. It doesn't mean it's an absolute unmoving truth. But it does have a very important operative force in society, and we have to understand the ways in which it works before we can get to a point that some people like to call post-racial. Or even to get to a point of equality, you actually have to think about what race is and how it operates in your life and in everyday life.
So we should think of it as a kind of imposed identity?
I mean, we can think of it in terms of external attribution, but I think that would undermine how people have responded to it and created forms of agency in terms of rejecting certain attributions of race. I mean, the category of black was a pejorative term until it was retaken by African Americans and turned from a negative into a positive. Yeah, you know, black man proud. I mean, the prevailing term, I think, was coloured up until the 1960s. But I mean,
there's a great history.
There is, of course, great history.
You know, my favourite term of the 19th century was Afro-Saxon.
I've heard them play. So I suppose there's something about the agency and the ways in which race as a means of resisting forms of attribution can be a vehicle for self-empowerment, and I certainly wouldn't want to overlook that. And I think that's sometimes one thing that anti-racists don't properly understand. You know, they fall around this semantic idea of race and think, well, if we do away with a term, surely we do away with a problem. And of course, all we do is exacerbate it and ignore it. I suppose I certainly share everything that's been said so far. One issue which always strikes me is in the shift from race as lineage, which may or may not be relatively banal, to a much more organised, concrete taxonomy with what we call scientific racism. I'm always struck by the fact that in the contemporary racialisation of some groups, there's a certain repository which is drawn upon, and I work a lot on Muslims and Islamophobia, and I often find that in the rhetoric on Muslims there's a continuity with things that have been said before, which is prior to the scientific racism changing of race. Now, I'm not suggesting there's direct linear one-to-one continuity, but there are interesting antecedents, which then suggest that, well, you know, race has this historically powerful recurring saliency and purchase, and if we want to understand some of the bigger things around who we are, whether as nations or something else, then you know we need to dip into a prior history of race perhaps too.
Yeah, well, I do think that it is important. I mean, when you say, I think the particular way of thinking about race that sort of crystallized in the mid-18th century is just one way. But as you say, ideas of peoplehood are antique. The earliest texts we have talk about kinds of people, and we know that they imagined them as it were inheriting their membership from their parents, so they thought of it as sort of lineage-based, as descent-based, and also, as I would say, in some sense, essentialist. What changes in the early 19th century is that the essence comes to be biological, but if you think about the ways in which Jews were talked about in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries in Spain, say, there it's not biology. The word biology was invented in 1800, but it's nevertheless the idea that well, this person who is Jewish can convert, can become one of the conversos, but there's still really something in there, some essence, some intrinsic. They used the language of blood actually, so that there's some blood. Some Jewish blood. And that means that if your deal with your Jewish and, in that case, Muslim populations is, well, you can stick around as long as you become Christian. If you then have a story according to which you can't become Christian, then there's no place for you. And as you know, in 1492, Jews were expelled from Spain. So I think that's another place where the story that develops in the 18th century has sort of looks back to. But it looks back to you know, ideas about Philistines and Assyrians and Achaeans and all that other stuff. But the key thing is that human beings. So there's a sort of psychological part of the story, I think, which is that we are very prone to essentialize groups. We're very prone to think that, well, we can distinguish these people from these people, so there must be some deep thing inside these people that's different from some deep thing inside these people that explains why we can tell them apart. And that deep thing is then going to lead us to feel that we should treat these people differently from these people, especially if one of these people is us. And so the idea that we are held together by some essence of usness, and they are held together by some essence of themness. I think that's a very widespread pattern, and it's to do with the deep feature of our psychologies, I think.
I'm interested in the way in which race becomes used to service a kind of political economy, and 1492 is really quite important there, not only because of what happens in Europe and the Reconquista, but also, of course, then the Christian colonization or Catholic colonization North America and native peoples there. There is a continuing question over the extent to which race serves that function. I think it does.
You mean then or now?
Now.
Oh, I see.
I think that one of the ways in which we can understand contemporary forms of racialization is very much driven by the political economy, not solely, not entirely. I don't think that helps us to understand or explain Islamophobia, but I think it helps to understand and explain forms of the racialization of, say, white folks.
Well, actually, political economy was never not there. And if you think about the ways in which you talked about historical categorizations emerging from slavery and then continuing into the empire, labor was a very big part of that. I mean, I think you touched on that, the idea that, so for instance, Thomas Carlyle writes a famous attack on black people, Quashi, as lazy, as sitting outside their huts, grinning and eating pumpkins with the juice running down their face. Why are black people in the mid to late 19th century seen as lazy? In part because they're resisting. And they're resisting political economy. They are resisting being transformed from slaves into so-called free wage laborers. They don't want to become laborers for hire on farms in Jamaica or in Trinidad. They want to look after their own piece of land and be self-sustaining. So what you get in the 19th century are these really angry tirades in the Times of London and similar British newspapers about how lazy blacks are and how, in fact, they need to be put to work, because if you don't put them to work, all they're going to do is sit outside their hut and eat pumpkins because they have no need to work. And so here you see the refusal to be wage laborers, and many freed blacks and their descendants absolutely refuse to work for their former masters in their plantations. And here you can see how blackness becomes connected to laziness, because you have a form of resistance that says, no, we're not going to become part of the wage economy of plantation labor, because we know what it's like to work on a plantation, and it wasn't fun, and the pitiful wages you're offering are not worth the economic slavery that will entail.
I mean, the question of stereotypes is coming up here, and the way that stereotypical characterizations have originated. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that, the relationship between our understanding of race and the way that leads into kind of racist stereotypes.
Well, I just touched on it, so maybe.
I mean, clearly it's an important part of the story, and it's one of the ways in which, as a result of that, pictures develop of kinds of people, and they may have their origins in specific moments in the political economy, but they kind of live on after the political economy has changed. So blacks get identified as lazy because they won't work in the system that's trying to be imposed on them after emancipation. But then the idea that blacks are lazy goes into British colonial discourse, yes. Where it's serving a different function, and where what's being resisted is not just a labour regime, but a total imposition of a colonial system and the system of command and so on. So, these stereotypes are very powerful, I think. And again, there are certainly all forms of identity have stereotypes associated with them. And the key thing, I think, to see is that what's striking about them is that even if there's some truth in them, they're almost always way less true than would be necessary to justify continuing using them. And often they're just totally bogus. I mean, so if one tries to think about, Jews are stereotyped as dishonest, but if you're involved, as Jews were perforce because they weren't allowed to own land, in banking and finance, on a small scale as well as a large scale, you can't be dishonest, right? It's the only asset you've got. So actually, that's not just, it's a little bit misleading. It's about as misleading as you could possibly be in that particular case because the association. So there are just lots of examples like that, I think, where you're saying that blacks are lazy when you've just ended a labour system in which blacks were working day and night and producing the material on which at that point.
And they were saying that. I mean, if you look at testimony from former slaves, they're saying we work like mad, and yet we get neither money nor appreciation, despite the fact that our labour is being extracted. And there are some really eloquent, speeches and testimonies and legal documents which speak of this awareness of being racialized because of the way in which your labour is extracted.
I mean, as a social scientist, my students don't get much exposure to literature, but the literature that I do share with them on this topic comes from Elizabethan England. It's the work of Shakespeare. Students get to learn about the portrayal of Othello and Shylock, who, by contemporary standards, are replete with redeeming qualities. They're very polysemic. Nonetheless, they are some kind of racialized affectation of characters of their time. Jews hadn't been readmitted to Britain by the time, during the time Shakespeare was writing The Merchant of Venice. Yet he had this prior notion of Jewry in his head, which informed this kind of tragic figure of Shylock. And of course, there was a moral panic during the time that Shakespeare was writing Othello in London about the place of Ottomans. Indeed, Queen Elizabeth I even had an edict suggesting they should be all expelled. So these stereotypes are ingrained in our culture, in our literature, in the common stories that we define as telling something meaningful about who we are, as British. Shakespeare always pops up in top 10 surveys of things that make you proud about Britain. Throw something like that. And then, of course, it's one of those narratives about who we are that is deeply racialized in ways that perhaps we don't always appreciate.
Yeah, I think one of the odd things about The Merchant of Venice is that the only racialized kind of money lending in London in Elizabethan times, paradoxically, was by Italian Catholics, the bankers from Lombardy, so that Shakespeare's audience knew that the group from which Antonio comes was actually engaging in money lending down the street, while in the play, as a good Christian, he represents himself as someone who will lend money, but only without interest. So there's lots of paradoxes, I think, about. As always with Shakespeare, what's really going on is I think quite complicated. But the fact that he can draw on stereotypes of Jews in a country without Jews is the point. So these stereotypes. And there aren't many. Most Elizabethan English people haven't seen a Moor. They've not seen. Certainly haven't seen a Moorish general like Othello. So ideas about who he is are nevertheless deeply available in the culture, and stereotypes about. And already we have, in the case of Othello, the association of black people with sexual appetite, the lascivious. Othello has lascivious lips, thick lips, which are associated with lasciviousness and so on. And again, this is in a country where there's no representation. This isn't a stereotype of an actually existing significant population of people. I don't mean there were no black people in England. But so the stereotypes are very, very powerful, and they do their work, even if there's hardly anybody empirically to represent the category that they're stereotyping.
I want to muddy that terrain just a little bit, though, because Elizabeth I expels blackamoors from the kingdom. So there are blackamoors in Elizabethan England. They are not racialized and then re-racialized as she expels them as foreigners. I think, and you touched on this, and it's very important. Shakespeare, on the one hand, is drawing on stereotypes and playing with them. But no society has a very static view of everything. People in any society disagree with each other. They also challenge stereotypes. So in Othello, in The Merchant of Venice, in The Tempest, we also get a challenging of racial discourse. We also get famously and very obviously, Hat's not a Jew, eyes too, right? I mean, the idea, you also get speaking, self-representing characters who challenge dominant stereotypes. Now, Caliban in The Tempest is a monster, but he's also someone who remains an icon for as a person who resisted colonialism, who said, "You have taught me your language so that I might curse with it," right? So he represents those people who took ideas from Britain or from Europe and turned them against Britain and Europe and colonialism. So I think it's important to think about paradoxes and ambiguities and the fact that with every stereotype there is also a pointing towards a counter stereotype and a complication of the picture.
It's really important, what you say is really important, and I think it's important also because it suggests a way we can draw on history, which is not just to focus on, as it were, the racist stereotypes and the bad moments, but to notice that we have traditions to draw on that are ways of fighting back against those stereotypes, so that we want both to acknowledge that our intellectual ancestors had failings, but also to notice that they made arguments, they made good arguments about these things. In The Jew of Malta, Marlowe's character has the Barabbas, the Jew, say, he makes the best argument against holding people responsible for their group that you could make. He says, "But say the tribe that I descended of were all in general cast away for sin. Shall I be tried by their transgression?" He's saying, you're using your stereotype, you're treating me as the Jew. But shouldn't you look at me? Shouldn't you decide whether I did any of those things? Should I be held responsible for what they've done? And so that argument is in play, even in a play that's where Barabbas is not the most super attractive character in the history of drama. So I think it's important because it means that we have within our traditions resources to draw on. We don't have to reinvent all the arguments. Many of the arguments are made all along. I like to remind people that it's true that Aristotle endorsed slavery for people that he thought were natural slaves, but arguments against slavery were already in play in his culture. It wasn't, it wasn't as it were a monologue. There was a polylogue about these things. So I think we can draw on different pictures from the bad ones, even if they're the dominant ones at certain points. I think another thing you said is really important is that this is a shifting thing, so that the dominant stereotypes shift very much. I mean, we were talking earlier about this, but that's very strikingly true of the Irish, right, who are essentially racialized as un-English, barely European, as it were. Savages. In North America, well into the 19th century, into the early 20th century. And now that's not part of the dominant picture of the Irish in North America.
And I think that's illustrated by a whole series of typically white categories. I mean, Trump's phrase about, appalling phrase about shithole countries reminded me of the phrase of the US statesman when migration from Europe changed from north to south, and in the early 20th century people were coming from Sicily and from Italy. What was the phrase? Europe vomiting. Yes. So white categories, interestingly, have been subject to these forms of racialization in the past, but in ways in which they have overcome to some extent. Yes. The Irish case is fascinating. There was a kind of almost a dialectical relationship to some extent in blackness and Irishness, reference to Irish as smoked N-words and so on. But there's a certain currency in whiteness, isn't there, that people of colour don't have. You can pass for one of the mainstream. You're surveyed in a different way, even though you may take pride in your Italian history or your Irish history or your kind of Northern European history. As an American, you are in.
Well, now.
You are
You're
now.
in now.
You are in,
yes.
Precisely.
Yeah.
In ways in which over the same time period, people of colour aren't in. Or they're still marked out as being different. Or they have to fight to be part of an American story. in a way in which I don't see why children of immigrants fighting.
Right, and that's, I mean, I still think that we see this in some of the support for the current president of the United States, whom I will not name. There is a kind of sense that, in fact, there's a straightforward rhetoric of the white nation and the white Christian nation and so on, which is not endorsed in the mainstream, but very much present, nevertheless, in the background, and has been there to some extent in waves, up and down, all along. And I think, you know, the dominant, I think it's true, the dominant, the Immigration and Naturalization Service of the United States has just taken out of its webpage its description of the United States as a nation of immigrants, presumably under direction from somebody appointed by the current president. But that's not going to work, because, at least not in the short run, because most Americans continue to think of the United States as a nation of immigrants, including in that understanding non-white immigrants, understanding that immigration brings people from everywhere, that as it were, the world has come. That's different, I think, from a difficulty that you have in Europe, which is that Europe continues to be imagined as white, so that there are lots of anti-racist, non-racist, decent Europeans who are perfectly happy to have non-white people around, but they think of them as kind of guests or people that they're being nice to, or that they're not really, as it were, automatically entitled to be here. And that's even true when they have ancestors who've been here, because they have white ancestors as well. They have ancestors who've been here just as long as, you know, anybody can trace white ancestors. I once gave a talk at the Aristotelian Society about the concept of race, and a very nice middle class lady at the back kept puzzling about why I had referred to myself at one point as English. And I said, well, my mother was English, and I can tell you where her ancestors were in England back to the 12th century. And she said, yeah, but you know what I mean. So I think you can't, that's a difficulty because the soil is imagined, as it were, white people are imagined as it were having come, they're autochthonous, they come out of the soil here. The way we Asantis, my sisters are in the front row, we Asantis think of ourselves as having come out of the ground in Asante, where we grew up. And so everybody else, we're nice to other people, we like having other people around, but they have to understand that we're the people of the soil, we're the people who came out of the ground here. And I think that in the United States, because the people who came out of the ground here, the only people who have a plausible claim to that are American Indians. Well, people want to call them Native Americans now, but that seems to me not helpful, since many of them call themselves Indians. So that doesn't work so well. But in Europe, you can do that. You can sort of say, well, we're nice to you and so on, and you're welcome here, but we and our ancestors came out of the ground here. And of course, that ignores the fact, among other things, that many of the ancestors of contemporary white people who are racialized as white in the United Kingdom came from the Norse world, or from they were Huguenots, or they were Spaniards. I mean, Italians. They came from all over the place. Poles, but the fact that our particular racial categories put so much pressure on appearance means that if you don't look non-white, you can sort of pass into the norm in a way that's very hard if you don't. That's just a contingent feature of the particular form of racial thinking that we had. You can have forms of racial thinking which are not so heavily tied to physical appearance, and for those, questions of passing, I think, can become extremely urgent and interesting, which is why I think the Spaniards were so obsessed with the conversos, because they couldn't actually tell them apart. They couldn't actually tell who had Jewish ancestry, whereas they thought they could tell who had African ancestry.
You remember the controversy about Cheddar Man? Remember
Yes.
when Cheddar Man is described as black in complexion? British people who considered themselves indigenous British were, meaning white, were not happy because that then raised the question of whether there was in fact a relationship between skin color and so-called indigeneity or coming from the ground. Who came from the ground? In any place, how do you answer this question? Who came from the ground? And in America, I think it's interesting that because of the prior claim of American Indians to the land, the discourse is not so much land as blood. So blood has now come back. The white race is imperiled. The white race will become a minority, and it's gone back to being biological with a vehemence that is really, again, about trying to find a way to lay defensive claim to an identity.
I enjoyed the possible explanations for the cheddar man there,
Yeah.
including that he may have been here on holiday. I certainly recognise the description you made of Europe. But I would put back to you that there's a certain ranking that goes on in North America right now, surely, in terms of declaring yourself a seventh generation American. Seventh generation American, you know. I have a claim on this, you know, I'm not
Right.
new from
People do that, though. Again, this is one of those places where I think it's useful to draw people's attention to what the metaphor requires. I mean, if the thought is all my ancestors back for 7 generations we're all here, the answer is no. There's hardly anybody in the United States who's racialized as white, who has no ancestors who came to the United States after the mid-19th century. So, and if the claim is, well, I can trace it back through men, well, then the question is, why should we care about tracing things back through men? So I think you can sort of, when people start playing those games, I think you can draw attention to their presuppositions and ask them whether they really want to endorse the presuppositions. But sometimes they do. And there's, not much you can do with those people except disagree with them.
You have a philosopher's capacity to appeal to logic and reason in the way in which social scientists tend to throw their arms with, myself included. And I suppose the other thing I would say about the UK is that you only get to this frame of who is and who isn't British based on ancestry if you forget about the empire, and the traffic across that for many centuries. What Britain was, in large part, was an imperial entity. Suddenly we're a state, suddenly we're a nation state. That's a relatively small period within the story of Britishness and Britain. And from Scotland, a nation which has conveniently forgotten its Roman Empire, looking down as it does at those nasty English who are mean to and not nice like us. They can only do that by uncoupling themselves from the imperial project, which is in our parents' life.
And having said that, I think we also have to think about the ways in which Britishness, and you see this very clearly with Brexit, is very dominated by Englishness. So yes, of course, the Scots and the Welsh and to some extent some Irish had a role to play in empire, although the Irish were also colonized. But I think that Brexit definition of Britain and who voted for Brexit, it turns out to be a heavy English vote. And so we also have to think about the ways in which Britain is constituted by empire on the one hand, but also in a disproportionate way by an empire which saw itself as English in values. I mean, you have Lord Macaulay talking about, creating people who are English in every way but blood and colour. So yes, it was a British imperial project, but the British Empire was also heavily overrun by Englishness, and that has come back with a vengeance. I think to talk about that.
I think we need to talk about the second point. I agree with it. Your first point, the phrase the English own the British Empire, the Scots ran it.
I do,
very true. About a third of the elite civil servants.
You mentioned Lord Macaulay.
I did. Yes. He saw himself as English.
Yes, he did.
As the East India Trading Company was Scots. When you think about the population size at the time, it tells you something about the role that the Scottish civil servant wants to play in this entity.
Well, and the jute in Dundee. I mean, we have very material connections to the empire.
Yeah, I think it's very hard to. So one thing I've never been able to explain to anybody in America is why the use of the word British to refer to everybody in England is not necessarily, and I mean England, is not necessarily helpful in understanding how people are thinking about themselves. So I do. So, for example, my mother was not British, as far as I can tell. My mother was English, and she came from the west of England. And her sort of literary references and her sense of what landscape is and so on, these were all tied up with English poets. I mean, maybe it's far north of the Lake District, but still. But whereas British is this category, it's essentially a category produced for the Empire, and partly out of the Napoleonic Wars, a conflict with the French over imperial stuff. And so it's not very old, the idea. I mean, there's the United Kingdom, but that's the union of some crowns.
That's not very old.
And that's not very old either. So I think, and I think one reason why it's hard to explain Englishness is because part of Englishness is a resistance to theories about things like Englishness. So the English don't like theories about Englishness because they think it's un-English to care about such stuff. So what you should do is sing with Flanders and Swan, the English are best. I wouldn't give tuppence for all of the rest. But you shouldn't have a theory of Englishness. And this distinguishes England as a sort of untheoretical idea from Britain, which I think is a legal and juridical and theoretical idea, and very distinctively from France, where France understands itself as an idea, not as something that therefore has to be thought about and theorized, and you have to teach people. And it can be. Now that doesn't mean there isn't a racial dimension in the French self-understanding. I think there is, though they debated it. I mean, they thought about whether during the Revolution they thought about whether they were going to have a kind of a notion of what France was that was defined purely by ancestry, or whether they were going to have a notion of France defined by commitment to the ideas of the Republic and the Revolution. And nobody won that. I mean, it went back and forth. But still, there's a long tradition in France of thinking of a French identity as something that can be theorized and therefore transferred, right? Because it's a matter of having the right beliefs and so on. So, in the mid-20th century, or mid to late 20th century, one of the greatest French poets, in the view of people who study French poetry in France, was Léopold Sédar Senghor, the president of Senegal. Why? Because he spoke beautiful French, because he was engaged in the things that mattered to the French, because he believed in the Republic and the Revolution and knew about Asterix and all that, and knew about Molière and Racine and the literature that mattered. So he could be, as he was, a member of the Académie Française, a foreign head of state could be a member of the Académie Française because he was committed to a certain picture of Frenchness. I don't think you could do that in England because you can't. There's no analogous thing that you could, as it were, grab onto and say, okay, I've got that, so now you have to count me in.
It's there a little bit around Imperial Englishness and the idea of creating people who could be English. Yes, and English literature, my discipline, developed as a colonial enterprise. It exists in India before it exists in England properly. It's used to train civil service administrators, on the one hand, to be able to go off into the colonies and communicate English values, which were then mapped onto British values. It was also used, and this is one reason in a way that I'm in this room talking, is it was used to create a native elite class who Lord Macaulay described as English in every way but blood and colour. And again, English literature, which is the discipline I teach, was used as the vehicle for culturally turning, kind of cultural eugenics, turning people into people who had so-called English values and could communicate them and help govern. So he wanted a class of interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, and he wanted a kind of brown English class, and it was actually in many ways a very, very successful project of cultural eugenics, and it's why it shapes India's relationship with Britain to this day.
Explains why there are so many Indian booker programs.
Oh, that too.
I mean, I suppose I want to push at the extent to which we're talking about the identity of particular racial projects, in this case, nation states, and people's national identity. And one of the things I find with your example of France is that the French state is stuck in terms of self-identity. It's stuck in a 1958 version of what it is. Whereas actually when you survey French people, they have quite hybrid plural identities of what being French is, the racial character to it. But there's a fluidity in the way in which the state struggles with. And I would say that it's also true of Britain, though with the exception that the competition within self-definition of national identity in the UK is that Britishness is currently sustained by black and ethnic minorities in England and Protestants in Northern Ireland. And when you look at the survey data, census data, they're the people who will most strongly self-identify with that national identity. In Wales, they will say I'm Welsh first, in Scotland they will say I'm Scottish first, and the English in England will say I'm English. So you have this paradox where British national identity is to some extent being remade precisely at the point in which frankly the majority are trying to uncouple themselves from this imperial or post-imperiality.
I wonder whether now might be a good moment to invite some questions from the audience.
Hi, are you going to get to this?
If you could wait for the microphone, yeah.
Hey. I wonder whether we want to aspire to a post-racial world, because it strikes me that what lies behind all the discussion so far is an individual desire to subscribe to an identity, and I wonder whether perhaps we should accept, or whether there's an alternative, that we view ourselves rather as an evolving construct moment to moment, and accept rather that we have no continuous sense of identity, that we can just look back at the accumulation of, our choices, and just accept that I am, either Cartesian lines, that there is something that is sufficient to who I am, that doesn't require subscribing to a group, a creation.
Thanks. Should we take another one and give you a bit more thinking time? There's one at the back there.
Thanks so much. My name is Jacinta, I'm PhD, not in any sort of related area, but fairly similar. The question I wanted to ask really, or the point I wanted to raise was, is it possible to sort of take this a little bit back? And I just wanted to hear your comments on the whole concept of race, whether you think there may be some sort of association with, for instance, the fact that black people, or people, if you like, from Africa, have been associated with Homo sapiens. There was Homo sapiens, there still are Homo sapiens, and they came from Africa, and they, for instance, made extinct Neanderthals within the northern hemisphere or the European kind of regions. That is the most recent finding, according to evidence. And I just wondered what you might think in terms of the concept of race and how it's often been perceived and being written about and conceptualized within the Western Hemisphere. Whether it has anything to do with the fact that Homo sapiens actually do dominate the entire planet, they have made certain races extinct.
Thank you. I will take just one more. Yeah.
At the beginning there was talk about essential to do with spiritual and such like, but leaving that out, and also in relation to what you said about cultural eugenics, are there different philosophical worldviews of different parts of the world? I find the Western philosophical tradition incredibly stuck down a tunnel. I can't wait for it to start making the attempt to communicate with the traditions of other continents, whether there is an actual written philosophical tradition or whether there is a worldview put in some formal form. I don't know if it does go on, but I know there are problems with language, and there seems to be quite a widespread philosophical view of language that we're kind of stuck inside our language, and I think we are very, I was reading a linguist recently who talked about us being very strongly determined by our language, but not absolutely stuck within it. We're not totally.
Thank you.
And I wonder what you could say about that, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to say, with regard to
I think we need to.
whiteness belonging in England, I find a problem with most theory about race coming from America and assuming England to be exactly identical, but you didn't. And
I'm sorry, but we do have lots of questions and not that much time.
yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to say this. I have brought up 2 daughters, one white, one mixed race, as a single parent at the bottom end of society. My mixed race daughter is picked up by the police, but it's my white daughter who has been made unwelcome here, who was told that she had absolutely no right, her and her young son, to housing in England. And with long legal
Okay, you have. I think you have made your point. Thank you.
Man who identified as British Asian, I would think of him as English because he's born in England, said he thought England was a classist country and that he thought classism was a variety of racism, which I find quite an interesting.
Thank you. Okay, 3 very diverse questions. I don't know if you want to come on first.
Maybe you should take them in order. I mean, I don't know if I should be the first person to answer the first question, since that's my nephew. So maybe, I mean, we shouldn't get trapped in our identities is the point. But on the other hand, I don't think it's up to us alone what happens with us. I mean, we don't have full control over it. So on the one hand, you want to make your own choices to the extent that you can. But on the other hand, they have to be realistic about what the world is going to do with you. And I think it's certainly, and part of that is recognizing that while there are patterns to how people interact on the basis of race, it's also true that in particular relationships and contexts, that is, you'll get things wrong if you assume that you're going to be racialized by everybody you meet in the same way. And it's kind of good, I think, to think to yourself, not to set out on the assumption that you're just going to be racialized in a particular way. I think that is it. But you have to accept the point that the lady just made, that you're more likely to be, it's just a fact about the way the North Atlantic world is organized, and here the United States and the United Kingdom are similar, that you're more likely to be stopped by the cops if you're black than not. It's a fact.
Well, in a sense, of course, a post-racial world is something one might aspire to, but equally, I think declaring ourselves a post-racial world when we are no such thing is not helpful, because you may walk away from race. Race probably won't walk away, as we know, from you. So I think we have to understand that, of course, there are no biological essences, there are no essences, there are no spiritual essences of race either, or any other essence. But it is a history that we are all creatures of history. We have descended biologically from people, but we have also descended historically from people. And those histories leave a very deep impact on us, as well as on society. And we can't wish it away. And I know you're not suggesting that, I'm just saying, you can't say, well, we'll just be post-racial. There are people who are claiming that, which is why I'm raising the issue that, oh, well, nobody... Lots of people will say, I don't see race, so you shouldn't talk about race. The point is, well, you think you don't see race, B, race sees you, and race sees me. And I think we have to deal with those realities before we can even start thinking about the post-racial.
Yeah. No, I very much share that. I mean, what I find striking about the post-racial is not the empirical claim that we are less racist, that racial outcomes have a declining significance, the declining significance of race. That I don't find problematic, because you can respond to that quite easily with evidence and data. What I find intriguing about the post-racial argument is, amongst those scholars who may once have talked about race as a vehicle for collective empowerment, people like Paul Gilroy, when he talks now about planetary humanism, that's a very interesting move on his part. He doesn't really want to talk about race in the same way. Well, he's kind of subsumed, he's brought it to a particular kind of, he's not being naive about this, but a particular kind of cosmopolitanism, which I don't know what that says about the investment of his labour in trying to understand and make race more visible. So I'm not unsympathetic to him and his project, but I find it slightly strange, because I think race has, in this Derridian way, has this kind of deferred presence. It's always there. We may not name it as race, but it's always there. It's a feature of the landscape, and we can talk about race without using racial language. Maybe that's what Bunyan Philbert meant when he said we have racism without racists. Nobody's racist here, except that racism thrives in these contexts, so nobody has responsibility for it. So I'm very cautious about thinking about ways in which we get beyond race in a way in which it doesn't give sufficient status to its presence, I suppose. There's kind of an answer in there somewhere towards it. Thanks for bearing with me.
And the next question was about Africa.
It was about the connection between the fact that the remaining humans are all descendants of Africans. It's not quite true, I think, that the Neanderthals disappeared because I gather that a significant proportion of especially European genomes among our species is in fact identifiably Neanderthal, so they weren't so much disappeared as incorporated. That is, they disappeared as a separate lineage, but they didn't all die out without progeny, because some of their progeny became human. I'm not sure. I don't think that. I think that stuff, that sort of information, is too new and too narrowly known for it to be plausible that it has a big influence on the way in which people think about race. Is my guess. So, I mean, so far as I have an answer to your question, I think it's probably not. It's a very interesting set of facts about how our species spread and so on, but I'm not sure that it plays a huge role in contemporary thinking about these things. One possibility which is relevant, which derives from our evolutionary history, I think, is that that some of these habits of mind, these essentializing habits of mind, may have been adapted at an earlier point in human evolution, when there was a lot of competition between small groups of humans, and therefore intense capacity to quickly to form others, groups of self and other, and to hyper-identify with the self. I gather some people think that there's reason to suppose that that is built into us because at some stage in our evolution that was helpful. And it may be that some of the competition that it was helpful in was indeed competition with Neanderthals. But as I say, I don't think of that as something that's important in the ideology of contemporary racial thinking.
This is slightly moving away from your question. One useful thing, I think, to talk about in relation to race is that races are not separate categories, and races blend into each other. We are all genetically related to each other. We are all genetically related to Africa in that sense. And so this idea that you can have a pure whiteness that is separate from blackness, or a Europeanness that is untouched by Africa, the borders that we create between cultures, civilizations, and races are human-created borders. Whereas biology, just like ideas, doesn't actually respect borders. So one of the things I always say is that when we talk about so-called Western civilization or British values, we forget the extent to which Europe, the West, and I know you touched on this earlier when we talked, the West and Britain drew on ideas from other cultures. And the so-called European Enlightenment was heavily dependent on ideas that came out of Africa and Asia. And so we need to also think about the ways in which borders between people or between ideas skew our thinking. And I think that's one useful thing, in relation to what you just said.
I think something else which your question foregrounds is the issue of physiology, and I think you both touched on it slightly, which is the way in which we often return to race through a new discovery of something which is embodied. It may be the science of genetics, and people get awfully excited about this until it confirms what we already knew in social theory. I always like Richard Lewontin's statement that there are more differences in clusters of gene patterns between North and South Wales than there are between Manchester and Malawi. But we won't call people in North and South Wales different races. We still seek it, don't we? I mean, epigenetics is another new kind of frontier in terms of the science of race. What is the relationship between physiology and environment? How will these change according to different conditions for different ethnic groups? Come on, you haven't been here before. My university, Edinburgh, I shouldn't mention the university. A university is a friend of mine. Has the largest collection of skulls, I think, anywhere in Europe as an activity of science. It's called the Skull. It was a home of phrenology in the Anatomical Museum, and I sometimes send my students there for an afternoon. They can either go there or they can go to the National Museum where they can see Tipu Sultan's sword, with this wonderful picture of the person who took it. No history of Scottish participation now. But they are shocked to think that we could try to discover the character, the personality, the capacity of people from doing that on somebody's head, which is pretty much what phrenology was. I find that sometimes we haven't necessarily learned the lesson of this and try to do that in different ways, but in more complex and elaborate ways that are equally fruitless.
It's perhaps worth insisting that because we're so drawn to these racialized ways of thinking, which I think derives from our sort of deep tendency to essentialism about any categorization that we develop, we theoretically minded people go to whatever is the high status discourse in their society in order to rationalize them. So before the rise of modern natural history and biology, you went to theology and to biblical texts to talk about the origins of races, because that was the high status discourse. And so, the human race was divided between the descendants of Ham, the descendants of Shem, and the descendants of Japheth, roughly speaking, blacks, whites, and Semites, for a period, because that was the sort of high status. When biology, through the 19th century, the natural sciences rise in prestige, and in the early 20th century, when the combination of Darwin and Mendel turn the life sciences into theoretical activities as opposed to just people wandering around collecting information about this organism and that. people try very hard to give an account of these differences in terms of the then high status science. And because genomics has sort of come back as a result of the new capacity to map individual genomes, and the fact that we have the computational capacity to analyze them, that's produced a whole new round of high prestige stuff, which is meant to rationalize these things. And I mean, I'm sure interesting things will come out of that, but they won't undermine the central point, which is that these categories are produced in social life for social reasons, and even if they happened to correspond roughly to some category that was for some reason biologically interesting, that wouldn't explain anything about them. The important things about them are historical and social, I think. I'm pretty skeptical about what I've read so far of the work that's attempting to use the new genomics to reconstruct racial categories, but that's just one man's opinion. But and I have to say that the best people working on this tell me that one thing that's pretty clear is that we don't really yet have a very good understanding of the statistical structure of the human genome, so that it's premature to say anything very much about it, even though we now have lots of new data. But my point is that even if all that turns out to be interesting in some way, it won't be interesting, I think, in ways that are important to the topic that we're discussing. It won't turn it into a scientific question, I don't think. You said many things, ma'am, but one of them was about class and classism, and I think that we haven't talked much about the intersections between race and other things. We haven't talked much about race and gender. We haven't talked much about race and class. Anybody who's trying to make serious sense of the moral lives of our own society, or your society, the one you live in, the United Kingdom, the one I live in the United States, these days is going to have to think very deeply about class and to have theories that help us to understand the connection between the many different dimensions of class, of which I will mention just 4. I mean, clearly, one dimension of class has to do with resources, access to money, to wealth and income. Another set of things has to do with connection, social capital, the capacity to mobilize people to do things. And a third has to do with cultural capital, which is well represented on the stage here. People who have lots of training and the capacity to mobilize information. And then there are sort of structures of power and prestige that seem to be independent either of connections or of cultural capital. I don't know what the right name is for that. So all of these things need to be understood in order to think about how what's going on in our society. And I would say, in particular, that we need to think deeply about them because huge amounts of the unfairness in the world today, of the injustice in the world today, are connected with these things, these different ways in which people are organized into hierarchies. And final point on this, I think there's a discourse that's developed, it's the discourse of meritocracy, which muddles and confuses and gets our discussion of these things off in the wrong place, because it pretends that the current distribution of the unequal distribution of wealth and income is to be explained increasingly by differences in the talent and effort of the people who have, and that's just false. I mean, it's just false. We are, I would say, this country is probably less meritocratic in that sense than it was when I was a kid, though it wasn't very meritocratic then. And my country, the one of which I'm a citizen and where I live, has become less of a country in which talent and effort success, and more of a country in which parental, social, cultural, and economic capital predicts success. It's more class, in that sense, it's more of a class society than it was when I moved to it. And these problems are not under serious discussion in the public realm. Lots of scholars talk about them, but I think that they're very serious problems. So I'm glad you raised the question of class. And the intersection between the issues I just raised and questions of race is very complicated.
Just want to follow on from that. I think it's absolutely important to look at the intersections. We've talked about race, class, gender, sexuality as separate things. They're not. But equally, I think we have to be careful about playing race versus class. And that is a discourse that I am finding increasingly popular in Brexit Britain, where class, when the word class is used, it's assumed to be white. So when you say working classes, you think of the working classes as white. Actually, the large majority of people in many places are not necessarily white working classes. There are black working classes, there are Asian working classes, there are mixed race working classes. So I find this race v class game in Britain troubling. And I also find the argument that people are punished for being white problematic. It's not as though, it's simply not true that if you're white and working class, you don't get housing because people who of color or mixed race are preferred. That is mythology. It is simply not true. It is not borne out by the stats, which I will leave my colleague here. No, we're going to finish. My colleague here to address. But I think that we need to think more about the intersections and less about playing race v class. It's not a game that's going to benefit anybody.
I mean, I am sympathetic to the view that some white people, the kind of the capital that comes with whiteness seems quite meagre relative to others. But we can control for class when we look at social outcomes, and statistically we do that all the time. You know, it may shock you to learn that if you are black in this country, you will on average earn 23% less if you have a degree than if you're white in this country and you have a degree. And that's including an analysis of class into that. You know, if you are from a British Pakistani, Bangladeshi, or indeed African Caribbean background, your chances are you may live in substandard accommodation. About 30% of those population groups live in substandard accommodation compared to about 8% for white groups. And that's controlling for the question of class. So there is a certain kind of what we may call ethnic penalty, I would call a racial disadvantage that groups experience, which belies some of the claims or the myths that are put forward that white people are left behind because black people are advancing. I think that's wholly false and empirically untenable.
We've only got about 10 minutes left, so I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Yeah. Yep, those two, please. Yeah. You've had your hand up since the beginning.
Thank you very much for a great discussion. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how race operates in post-colonial societies, and if how like imperialism has affected race thinking, and its and affects race thinking currently in those societies. And I'm thinking kind of about how, for example, a lot of colonial powers had a tiered system when thinking about the different colonies, where there were some communities that were more civilized than others, or for example, how race relations exist within as well, where like how Gandhi was in South Africa, for example. So if you could speak a little bit about that.
Thank you.
I've already two race questions actually. So the first is about the term people of colour, which linking to that, I think I'm ambivalent about. So I think it's very often a useful unifier and also a range of systems that have been established and prejudices that exist between communities that aren't right. And so I want a slight discussion about how it's used and what it means, or what it uses when you use that term. And the second is about the nature of racism. So over Christmas, I had a big argument with my extended family about whether or not white people could be racist. So what does it mean for somebody to be racist? What is racism? And what constitutes a racist action in terms of power structures and prejudice? Just a bit more fleshing out of both the nature of the term people of colour and racism as a kind of social institution and an individual quality.
Great, thank you. We'll take those two.
Do you want to kick off on that?
Well, yeah, I'm looking towards you, Priya. You're probably looking towards look at Anthony, right?
I mean, so just on the question of, I mean, obviously, one thing that happened with the racial discourses that developed in the North Atlantic is that they travelled into the empire. And there are many examples of this. I mean, for example, one horrifying example, I think, is the way in which the Hutu-Tutsi distinction in Rwanda and Burundi, which is essentially a confection of a bunch of Belgian anthropologists, turned into a racial distinction. Because if you actually if you look without those lenses of the populations of these countries, they aren't divided between a bunch of tall people with long heads and a bunch of short people with round heads, which is sort of the stereotype of the Tutsi and the Hutu, and there are also other people in Rwanda and Burundi like the Twa. But that led to a way of thinking about the distinction, which is present in the lead up through the first large-scale ethnic conflicts in Rwanda and Burundi in the 50s and 60s, right up through to the genocide. So there's a perfect example of a way of thinking that I think we can think of as profoundly rooted in European racial thinking, went with the empire into, in this case, Africa, and led to horrendous results which you can't understand unless you understand them in connection with the history of racism. It's not just a bunch of Africans deciding to classify themselves as Hutus and Tutsis and decided to fight one another. That's absolutely not the story at all. They had to have, in the Belgian period, that they had to have ID cards that told you whether you were Hutu or Tutsi, and so people had to decide which to be, most of them not having any idea beforehand that that's what they were, so they had to make decisions on the basis of stereotypes, most of the stereotypes being Belgian stereotypes, not local ones. So I think there are many, so that's just one example, I think, of the sort of thing that happens when race goes, this particular notion of race went global, and it has had profound effects. I think the ways in which, frankly, it's hard to make sense of the current Burmese government's discussion of the Rohingya without thinking that they're using racial categories that are certainly not traditional Burmese categories, and so on. So I think, yes, the bad things happen because of that.
The Rohingya example is an interesting one because, yes, on the one hand, there is a transferring of categories and an anthropological thinking and kind of tribalizing and categorizing that is colonial. Equally, colonialism succeeded and rooted itself by collaboration with native elites and with native hierarchies wherever it went. And so in the Myanmar case, what you also have is it feeds lethally into Buddhist nationalism. It feeds lethally into existing hierarchical divisions and struggles over land. I mean, we don't talk very much about how much the Rohingya struggle is about appropriating land from people who occupy the so-called Rohingya areas. And I think that we need to, in Gandhi's case, yes, on the one hand you could say Gandhi was clearly operating with colonial categories. He was in South Africa, he was working with the South African racial categories, but how lethally racial thinking intersects with caste thinking. And that's something that post-colonial Indians have yet to reckon with, because they're very happy to talk about race, but much less happy to talk about caste, and much less happy to think about the ways in which the upper castes facilitated colonial racism. So I'd say, yes, we want to talk about colonial influences and very deep-rooted ideas that Anthony referred to, but we also need to look at its intersections with dangerous native hierarchies and exclusions.
Yeah, that's very well put, and I always struggle with the relationship between caste and race. I'm not sure when one began and when one began and the other one took over, if you see what I mean, and where those intersections were. But it's hard not to see that so much of it falls around that.
Well, where it falls is the invisibility, in the way that to be white and to be English is to be a norm, to be unmarked, to not have a race, right? Nobody really talks about whiteness. If you're black, Asian, minority, ethnic, then you have a race. But nobody on a day-to-day basis thinks about whiteness as a race. Similarly, upper castes in India don't think of themselves as having caste privilege. And it really maps on quite neatly there. We are the norm. We don't have a caste identity. So when it's challenged, just as racism or white supremacism is challenged, the response will be, I don't see caste. I'm above it. Just as people will say, I may be white, but I don't see race. And this is how that is the privilege of being the unmarked norm. And I think that's where they lethally overlap.
The other example we might put into this is, of course, Kashmir. The way Kashmiri populations have been racialized with this. Oh God! I mean, it feels like an occupation. My late father was Kashmiri. If you asked him where he was from, he was from Kashmir. He was from Suriname. But of course, Indians would claim for themselves, and Pakistanis would claim for themselves. But he was Kashmiri, and the plight of the Kashmiris is not one that we hear a great deal about. But it's characterized by all the hallmarks of oppression and occupation that we see elsewhere in the world, when you have a dominant, nationalizing, imperial even power. But I can't help but think about the extent to which that's a legacy of partition too, and the particular norms and conventions which facilitated the distinction of those populations.
It's perhaps worth adding to the picture that there's a different set of stories that one might want to tell about the so-called New World. So there too, the story of race in Argentina or in Brazil is connected with these European stories, but it's obviously developed autonomously, the same, just as the White Australia policy was in some sense connected with Britain and the Empire, but developed its own shape and forms. And I think, there is this interesting thing, it's back to the difference between the places where as it were, people think of the white people as coming out of the ground, and the other places where the white people are in charge, in Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, North America, but they didn't come out of the ground then. And in order to explain their relations to everybody else, including the indigenous, the first peoples of these places, the language that ended up being used was very much the language of race, I think. So we've given you lots of examples.
There was one question
so
you should probably also remember to address.
Yes, good.
Would you,
in the last 2 minutes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, do you remember?
It was about the structures of racism and who can be racist.
Yes, what does it mean to be racist? Yes? Okay. Tough one.
I think from an ethical point of view, anybody can get into the frame of mind, of the racist frame of mind, with respect to some system of categories. Maybe it's difficult for African Americans to get into that frame of mind in relation to white people in the United States. Maybe it's possible, but probably quite difficult. But they can get into that frame of mind in relation to people they think of as new immigrants in the United States. They can get into racist attitudes. You can have racist attitudes to people of South Asian ancestry among African Americans in the United States. So I think, if that's your question, the question is, can the fact that you're at the bottom end of one of the racial hierarchies, does that somehow make it impossible for you to practice racism? I think it doesn't.
But on the other hand, I don't accept the word reverse racism, the phrase, because racism is about a structure. It's about a power structure. And again, I make the comparison with caste. Caste is a power structure. So when Dalits assert their identity in a caste-ridden society, or when black people assert their identity in a white supremacist society, that is not reverse racism. That is if you just render racism about attitudes, it's not just an attitude. It's about institutional structures, it's about who has power. And I have found in Britain very often that if you talk about race, and you talk about whiteness, very quickly the accusation of being a reverse racist will follow. And the fact is that just as you can't really have reverse sexism, because in a patriarchal world where men dominate, there is no such thing as reverse sexism. So yes, attitudinally, we can all be racist. We can all be sexist. Even women can be sexist. Black people can be racist. But if you're talking about race seriously as part of a historical power structure, then these easy reversals are not possible because the ground is not level.
Last point I was going to say that. I've been applauded for shutting up. I was going to say that in my endless conversations with people involved in the policy process who want to measure integration, quote unquote, despite my best efforts to dissuade them from that, the only category that I can't get them to take seriously is when minorities start to become racist towards other minorities. That's always a good indication of integration.
Thank you very much for coming.